From a young age, every girl learned the rhythms of the household, preparing for her future role.
You think you know what childhood looks like. A small bed, soft blankets, a shelf of toys, little shoes waiting by the door, food prepared just for children, bright clothes chosen for comfort and personality. But in the land where Jesus walked, childhood was not protected in that way. It was fragile, public, useful, watched. A child in first-century Jewish Galilee was not raised inside a world built around the child. The child was raised inside a world built around survival, family honor, covenant memory, and the hard labor of staying alive one more season. And that changes everything. Because when we open the Gospels and see a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths, when we hear Jesus speak of daily bread, when we watch children brought to him through a crowd of adults, we are not looking at sentimental scenes. We are looking at life close to the bone. So, step back with me. Feel the dust under your feet. Hear the hand mill grinding before sunrise. Smell wool warmed by the body and smoke trapped in cloth. Listen to the creak of leather sandals and the low voices of women baking bread in the dim light. This is what children ate. This is what children wore. And this is often overlooked when we read the Gospels. A child's life began in danger. Not metaphorical danger, real danger. In the time of Jesus, many children never reached adulthood. A mother carried not only hope, but risk. Birth took place in an ordinary household world of stone, packed earth, cloth, water, blood, prayer, and waiting. There were no modern nurseries, no sealed-off spaces of comfort. Family life pressed close. Women knew what birth could cost. Men knew that the survival of the household rested partly on whether children lived. And when a baby was born, that child entered the family not as the center of the universe, but as part of the household's future, its labor, its name, its continuity, That is why Luke's image of Mary wrapping Jesus in swaddling cloths is so striking. Those were not random rags tossed around a poor infant for dramatic effect. Swaddling was normal care. It meant the child was being properly tended, bound in narrow cloth bands, held secure, watched over. In other words, the gospel scene is tender, yes, but also ordinary. Holy, and ordinary at the same time. This changes how we read the birth of Jesus. Because the Son of God did not enter some idealized childhood. He entered the same vulnerable world every other Jewish child entered, a world where being wrapped, fed, and kept alive were acts of love against the constant threat of loss. And for the first years of life, what a child ate was simple, the mother's milk. In the ancient Jewish world, infants were commonly nursed for a long time by modern standards, often for years rather than months. That means the earliest experience of nourishment was not jars, formulas, or packaged food, but the body of the mother, again and again, day and night, through heat and dust and interrupted sleep. The rhythm of childhood began there. Held in arms. Carried in cloth. Soothed in the noise of a working house. The baby would smell olive oil, smoke, wool, earth, sweat, and bread before ever understanding words. The baby would hear grinding stones, goats outside, sandals on the floor, whispered blessings, family arguments, laughter, prayer, and crying infants all mixed together. Childhood was not private. It unfolded in the middle of communal life. Then came the slow crossing into solid food, and this is where modern assumptions fall apart. There was no separate children's menu. No sweet cereals. No processed snacks. No soft, colorful treats designed for entertainment. Once weaned, children entered the same basic food world as everybody else, only in smaller portions and according to what the household could afford. And that food world was built above all on grain. Bread was not a side item. Bread was life. In Roman Palestine, bread made up much of the ordinary diet, especially for the poor. Wheat if a family had more means, barley more often when life was harder. Bread, oil, pulses, dried figs, these were the things that kept a family going. Lentils, beans, peas, chickpeas. Olives. Sometimes fruit in season. Figs, dates, grapes, pomegranates. Fish in places close enough to trade for it or catch it. Eggs at times. Herbs for flavor. Meat, much less often than many people imagine. For most children, daily eating was not about preference. It was about sufficiency. That matters. Because when Jesus teaches his followers to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread," he is not speaking in poetry detached from ordinary life. He is naming the pressure that stood in every home. Will there be enough grain? Enough flour? Enough oil? Enough fuel? Enough until the next harvest? Enough for the children? This detail is often overlooked. A child in Jesus' world likely woke not to breakfast waiting on a table, but to work already underway. Before the sun rose high, grain had to be ground. Dough had to be kneaded. Fuel had to be gathered. Bread did not appear as a convenience. It arrived through effort, repetitive, daily, exhausting effort. Picture a girl watching her mother's hands press dough. Picture a younger child smelling straw smoke and animal dung burning in a clay oven. Picture flattened rounds slapped against the hot inner wall of a tanner oven, baking in minutes, smoke rising, heat pushing against the face. The child learns early that food comes through labor, that meals begin long before eating, that bread means hands, shoulders, ash, waiting. And what did that bread taste like? Not fluffy loaves from a bakery window. Think denser. Coarser. Sometimes darker. Fresh when the day went well, dry when time had passed, dipped in oil if oil was there, eaten with pulses, herbs, olives, or fish if the household had them. Dried figs or fig cakes could provide sweetness and energy. Children would know the difference between a day of enough and a day of less. They would not need anyone to explain it. Hunger sharpened memory. That is one reason the feeding stories in the Gospels land with such force. Bread and fish were not symbolic because they were exotic. They were powerful because they were familiar. They belonged to the real economy of ordinary people. And now look at what those children wore. Again, not costumes from stained glass windows. Not bright clean robes drifting through golden sunlight. Real clothes were fewer, heavier with meaning, harder to replace. Most ordinary families did not have wardrobes. Clothing had to last. Cloth had to be spun, woven, repaired, passed down, guarded. A cloak was valuable. A tunic mattered. Sandals were not fashion statements. They were protection between skin and stone. Children usually wore simpler versions of adult clothing. Little boys and little girls were not dressed in some separate fantasy category called kid fashion. They entered the clothing customs of their world early. The basic garment was the tunic, a simple woven piece of cloth, shaped for wear, belted when needed. For working males, tunics were shorter for movement. Women's garments fell longer. Over that came an outer wrap or cloak when needed. Girls and women were marked by modesty expectations, and grown females especially covered the hair in public. A small child's clothing would be practical first. Reused cloth. Repaired edges. Fabric chosen by what the household could produce or obtain. Wool was common. Linen was used as well. Colors existed more than people assume, but ordinary life was still ruled by cost, labor, and durability. Every piece of clothing represented time. This means a child did not casually ruin clothes. If a hem tore, if a sandal strap snapped, if a cloak wore thin before winter, that was not minor. That was household pressure. This changes how we read the Gospels too. When Jesus speaks about tunic and cloak, he is not speaking about extra layers hanging and used in a closet. He is speaking about deeply valuable possessions. When the woman reaches for the border of his garment, she likely touches the tasseled fringe of the outer garment, the visible edge of covenant faithfulness. Cloth carried identity. Cloth carried obedience. Cloth carried status and memory. Even baby cloth carried meaning. Then as the child grew, clothing began to signal movement into responsibility. There was no long protected zone of modern adolescence. Childhood in that world moved toward usefulness. Not according to a neat birthday chart, but according to strength, maturity, and the needs of the household. A child learned by proximity, by imitation, by being there. A little girl stayed near the domestic center of the house. She learned bread, water, weaving, cleaning, younger siblings, the rhythms of lamps and storage and fuel. She learned not because someone asked what career she preferred, but because the household depended on capable women. A little boy, as he grew, moved more into the world of fields, flocks, tools, trade, and the visible authority of men. Not every family lived the same way, and not every village had the same work. But the principle was constant: a child was being formed for the survival and honor of the family. Honor mattered as much as hunger. Maybe more. Because in the first-century Jewish world, people did not think of life primarily in terms of private self-expression. They thought in terms of reputation, obedience, shame, belonging, legitimacy, and the public standing of the family. A child's behavior reflected on the house. A child's clothing reflected resources and modesty. A child's body itself stood inside a network of expectations, about purity, maturity, marriage, inheritance, and obedience. So when Jesus places a child in the midst of adults, or when people bring children to him and the disciples try to block them, the moment grows sharper in context. Children were loved, yes. They were blessings, yes. But they were also socially low in power, dependent, and vulnerable. Jesus is not praising childhood because it is cute. He is exposing a kingdom truth through those who had little status of their own. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Now imagine the feel of an ordinary day. Morning light enters a stone house in Nazareth or another Galilean village. The floor is hard beneath bare feet. The air is cool at first, then warming. A child pulls on a tunic that has already belonged to someone else, maybe stitched again at the shoulder, maybe belted with a simple cord. The cloth scratches slightly. Smoke from the previous night still clings to it. Bread is shared, not individually plated. Oil is precious. Dried fruit is welcome. Maybe olives. Maybe a pulse stew later. Maybe fish, if the family is near supply or trade routes. Water is handled carefully. Wine mixed with water belongs more securely to adults and to households with more means. Meat is rare enough to be memorable. The child eats what the household eats. The child wears what the household can spare. And the child learns, every single day, that life is received, not assumed. That is why the parable of the prodigal son hits so hard when the father restores the boy with robe and sandals. Those are not decorative touches. They are public signs of reinstated honor. The son is not merely fed. He is reclothed. His shame is covered in front of the community. This detail is often overlooked. In the world of Jesus, to be clothed was not only to be protected from heat and cold. It was to be placed, named, and seen. And then there were the festival days, the days children remembered. Passover. Pilgrimage. Crowds. Dust on the roads. Adults focused, alert, moving in groups for safety and obligation. A child would taste memory through food long before understanding theology in full. Bitter herbs. Bread shaped by time and command. Questions asked. Stories repeated. Israel remembered not in abstractions, but in meals. So when Luke tells us that Jesus went up with his family and stayed behind in the temple at 12 years old, we are not reading a detached religious anecdote. We are seeing a Jewish child formed in a world where family, feast, food, clothing, travel, worship, and identity were woven together. Childhood was not split into religious life and real life. It was one fabric. And yes, fabric is the right word. Because everything touched everything. Bread and prayer. Cloth and honor. Childhood and survival. Home and covenant. This is why the Gospels feel different when we recover the texture of ordinary life. Jesus did not float above this world. He entered it fully. He lived in a village world where grain had to be crushed, dough had to be baked, garments had to be mended, sandals had to endure, and children had to grow up quickly under the eyes of family and neighbor. He knew what wool felt like in heat. He knew what bread meant in a poor house. He knew the sight of children in simple tunics standing close to their mothers, half-fed maybe, dusty, watching the adults, absorbing the world that would soon demand their labor too. And that should strengthen Christian faith, not weaken it. Because the incarnation becomes even more astonishing when it becomes more concrete. The Son of God did not merely appear among humanity in general. He entered a real childhood world. Jewish, poor, disciplined, embodied, vulnerable. He was wrapped as babies were wrapped. Fed as children were fed. Raised among the textures, limits, and expectations of ordinary village life. Not above history. Inside it. And if God came that near, that low, that specifically, then the gospel is not an escape from the real world. It is God's answer within it. So the next time you read about swaddling cloths, about daily bread, about garments, tassels, sandals, or children running toward Jesus, slow down. See the stone house. Hear the mill. Smell the smoke. Feel the rough weave against the skin. And remember, these were not background details. They were the world he entered to save. If this documentary helped you see the Gospels with new eyes, let me know in the comments, and tell me which detail changed the way you read Jesus' world the most. And if you want more historically grounded biblical documentaries like this, like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next journey back into the world of Scripture.